Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung used his Liberation Day address to lay out his vision for Korea's path ahead. On Japan, he called for deeper cooperation while stressing the need to face the wounds of the past and build greater trust between the two countries. He also unveiled a new peace initiative towards North Korea, proposing talks to formally end the Korean War and move towards a peace regime, although Pyongyang has yet to respond. So what do these messages tell us about the Lee administration's foreign policy direction moving forward? For answers to this, we connect to Christophe Gaudin, professor of political science at Kookmin University. Good to see you.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
And also joining us is Hannah Kim, associate professor at Sogang University's GSIS. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start the discussion first with Professor Gaudin, with the big picture, of course. So President Lee laid out a vision centered on peaceful coexistence, pragmatic diplomacy, and an irreplaceable Korea. We wonder what stood out for you the most from his address.
Well, the way I see it, what makes Korea irreplaceable, so to cite President Lee, is that in the world we live in, there are very few powers, very few middle powers like Korea, who are able to expand peace offers all over the world. If you think of it, for decades, ever since the end of the civil war in Korea, Korean diplomacy used to be backed by the US heavily. And now that the US is not the reliable ally it used to be, with these uncharted waters we're forced to navigate under the Trump administration, what's really remarkable with the Lee administration and their diplomacy is how they've been able not to antagonize any major power. If you think of it, in the world we live in, how many powers are able to keep negotiating fruitfully, both with America and China, both with Europe and even to some extent Russia, the Muslim world, etc., etc. So when President Lee says that Korea is irreplaceable, and when he tries to launch these peace talks with North Korea, I think that in the end, all of these initiatives belong in the same big picture. Korea today, it is in Korea's best interest not to antagonize anybody, and so it is what the Lee administration has been able to achieve quite successfully so far in the past year.
Right, that could be the definition of the irreplaceable Korea of the Lee administration. Now, what about Professor Kim? If you look at the speech as a whole, how did you assess it? And also, compared to last year, what stood out to you about the direction of the current administration?
I think what stood out the most was that this year's speech was much more concrete and more pragmatic than last year's. So last year, President Lee was mainly trying to establish basic principles of his foreign policy, especially towards North Korea. And he emphasized respect for North Korea's systems. He rejected unification by absorption, and he tried to reassure Pyongyang that South Korea had no hostile intentions. And this year, he seemed more interested in explaining how those principles could actually be translated into policy. And at the same time, I think the speech showed a broader effort to pursue pragmatic diplomacy on both North Korea and Japan. Towards North Korea, for example, the emphasis is increasingly on peaceful coexistence and managing tensions rather than putting unification at the center of immediate policy. And towards Japan, President Lee seemed to strongly show that he was, supporting closer cooperation in areas such as the economy, technology, and regional security, while also making it clear that sustainable cooperation requires continued attention to historical issues. And his reference to the Kim Dae-jung Obuchi Declaration, for example, was particularly meaningful in this kind of regard. So overall, it seems as though the direction is becoming clear where it's less ideological and much more practical, but without abandoning the historical and political principles that are important to his domestic supporters.
So we have seen some more concrete directions from compared to the past. Now, if we turn to Japan now, President Lee has highlighted the progress made through the so-called shuttle diplomacy over the past year and also pledged to expand cooperation based on national interests. Professor Gaudin, what does this tell us about where Japan fits into his foreign policy right now?
Well, at the center, as Professor Kim mentioned, something that's quite new about the speech compared to last year's address is the huge emphasis put on Japan and a very concrete emphasis with a concrete course of action that President Lee has tried to describe as precisely as possible. So now, where are Korea and Japan standing? Where they are standing is that there are very few democracies in the world we live in, particularly in Asia, and they share a lot of common interests. In particular, because both of them are interested in trying to maintain a certain level of normalcy in international relations, in particular not to be crushed by both the US and China. That said, their approaches are relatively different because President Lee claims to be pragmatic. He's not ideological in his approach, while you can see that Ms. Takaishi, so Japan's prime minister, is taking bolder statements in terms of international policy. We saw that last year with the stance she took on Taiwan. We saw that last week or the week before when she didn't fear to antagonize Vladimir Putin about the Kuril Islands issues, etc., etc. So what I think President Lee is doing is that he's trying to strengthen the relation with Japan because Korea needs that. Korea needs allies in this dangerous world. But as much as possible, he's trying to pull Japan away from the bold nationalistic statements that Ms. Takaishi is forced to take from time to time in order to please a conservative electorate. So it is, I think, a very subtle game that President Lee is playing now, getting close to Japan and somehow subtly trying to suggest Ms. Takaishi that her best interest is to follow a similar pragmatic approach without antagonizing China, Russia, or of course the United States.
Right, so clearly that very fine line, it signals that Japan is still a very important partner for Korea. But at home, President Lee has pledged to recover assets that are improperly, quote, improperly accumulated by pro-Japanese collaborators and use them to support independence patriots and their families. What do you make of this decision, Professor Kim?
I think this issue and this topic in general has received a lot of attention recently, not just because of Gwangbokjeol or National Liberation Day, but also because of a controversy related to a Korean actress who has reportedly ties to pro-Japanese collaborators. But in general, I think what the Lee administration or Lee Jae Myung's pledge, when we think about it, should be best understood primarily as an issue of historical justice rather than simply as an anti-Japanese measure. Now, President Lee specifically referred to assets that were improperly acquired through collaboration and proposed using recovered assets to provide greater support for independent patriots and their families. So symbolically, this carries a really strong message. And it's saying that those who benefited materially from collaboration should not be treated more favorably than those who made sacrifices for Korea's independence. But at the same time, the implementation will be very important. There needs to be clear and credible evidence linking particular assets to collaboration, along with transparent procedures and appropriate legal safeguards. And it's also important to really distinguish between accountability for individuals who directly benefited from wrongdoing and responsibility attributed to their descendants. And so if the policy remains narrowly focused on improperly acquired assets and is implemented through clear legal procedures, then it could contribute to historical accountability and recognize those who fought for independence. But if it becomes overly politicized or is perceived as targeting people based on their family background, it could deepen existing divisions and it may actually hurt the attempts or path in terms of contributing to reconciliation.
Right, so it's a very sensitive topic, and how it would be implemented forward would be very crucial. But all of this, again, it's coming at a time when, Seoul is still seeking closer cooperation with Tokyo. Professor Gaudin, what kind of impact do you think could this latest move have on bilateral relations?
It's a very fine line. President Lee is forced to navigate. Because here, what I think is important is that by pushing for historical accountability, President Lee is somehow distancing himself from all of these fake news, post-truth narratives that spread all over the world and that poison democracies. Here, as Professor Kim mentioned, the problem with Japan is relatively simple. On the one hand, there is a need for historical accountability, because without accountability, there can be no real peace, there can be no real democracy either. But on the other hand, if these claims are being weaponized for political purposes, obviously they are to lose all substance. So here, I think President Lee is acting both because of domestic reasons, because his electorate wants historical accountability, but also because Korea, being one of the very few democracies in Asia, every time there is historical accountability, it is good for democracy, and thus it is good for Korea. So right now, I cannot speak for the future. Wait and see. There is a danger for these claims to be weaponized, but for the moment they are not. So let's see how all of this unfolds in the future. There's no rush.
Right, definitely. So we'll really have to see how the government would be managing his story and cooperation moving forward. Now, we'll also touch upon North Korea as well. President Lee presented 3 principles for peaceful coexistence and called for 2 Koreas to reduce hostility and return to dialogue. We've been hearing this stance quite for a long time, but what is different about this approach? And do you think it could help restart inter-Korean engagement, Professor Kim?
I think what's particularly important about President Lee's approach is that there's a clear progression from last year's principles to this year's policy blueprint. So in last year's Liberation Day speech, President Lee laid out the 3 basic principles towards North Korea, which were that South Korea would respect North Korea's existing system, it would not pursue unification by absorption, and it would not engage in hostile acts. And the basic purpose of this was reassurance, right? To make clear what South Korea would not do and to create conditions for rebuilding trust. But this year, he explicitly said that it was time to move from principles to actions. So now he's expanding those ideas into 3 blueprints for peaceful coexistence. So the first is inclusive, peaceful coexistence based on mutual respect and reducing hostility. And the second is stable, peaceful coexistence, which means that it's creating institutional safeguards to manage tensions and prevent military crises or unintended escalation. And the third is responsible, peaceful coexistence, which connects peace on the Korean Peninsula to regional and global peace. And this includes discussions on ending the Korean War, replacing the armistice with a peace regime, and finding practical ways to halt further advances in North Korea's nuclear capabilities. So I think here the most important change is that President Lee is moving from reassuring North Korea about South Korea's intentions to instead proposing an institutional framework for managing long-term coexistence. So this could lower the barrier to dialogue because Seoul is not demanding that the most difficult issues be solved before talks. And it's showing that it can, it's stopping or trying to do this before talks can even begin. But of course, whether or not this actually restarts engagements will ultimately depend on North Korea's willingness to respond.
Right, so we'll have to hear from North Korea on that. But another proposal that the Lee administration has made was for relevant parties to formally end this Korean war and move from the armistice towards a peace regime. Professor Gaudin, how realistic do you think that proposal is?
It's always very difficult to tell whether or not anything is realistic with North Korea. It's always a very gray area you're forced to navigate. What we can say is that implicitly, if you want to discuss a peace regime with North Korea, it means that somehow you are recognizing that the North Korean regime is here to stay. What it also means, and is no less interesting, is that now President Lee, you need to keep in mind that only 2 years ago, the former President Yoon tried to antagonize North Korea with drone attacks in order to support his own claims for martial law. So the U-turn that President Lee has been taking is quite radical. Now President Lee is discussing coexistence, and in fact this is in line with everything his party, the Democratic Party, has been arguing for. I mean, President Moon Jae-in, President Kim Dae-jung, they were on the same line, basically. The problem is that no matter how willing they are to engage with North Korea, we know from history that every time this ended badly. It ended with North Korea basically benefiting, taking everything there was to take, and eventually withdrawing. So of course something needs to be done. Of course peace is always better than war, but North Korea is not the most reliable of partners. And honestly, if I were in charge, I wouldn't know what option to take. What I think is that pragmatic diplomacy is the only option we have, but we always need to keep in mind somewhere in the back of our minds that South Korea wants coexistence, but is it what North Korea wants to? I think that's the real question we need to address in this context. The problem has never been the South, it's the North.
So quite a lot of uncertainty when it comes to North Korea's next moves. So from North Korea, we're still yet to see a response from them regarding President Lee's proposal. What do you make of Pyongyang's silence, Professor Kim? And also, what could actually bring the North back to the table?
As Professor Gaudin mentioned, it's always very difficult to, ascertain North Korea's side, but I would not really be surprised by North Korea's silence. Pyongyang has spent the past few years redefining South Korea as a hostile state and has repeatedly rejected Seoul's attempts at engagement. And so responding positively to President Lee immediately would require North Korea to adjust a position that it had invested heavily in politically for the past few years. But there is an interesting development. North Korea has not responded directly to President Lee's Liberation Day proposal, yet President Trump says Kim Jong-un has responded to his outreach, right? And so that suggests that the real diplomatic opening may initially come through Washington rather than through direct inter-Korean dialogue. And North Korea may believe that negotiations with the United States, can produce things it values more directly. for example, changes in sanctions or military exercises or the broader security relationship. So Seoul's most realistic role right now may be to act as a facilitator or a pacemaker of some sorts, encouraging U.S.-North Korean engagement while creating an environment in which inter-Korean dialogue can eventually follow in the future. So in that sense, progress in inter-Korean relations may depend partly on whether broader U.S.-North Korea diplomacy begins to move again.
Right, so we are currently seeing President Trump knocking the door on North Korea again, and we'll still have to see how the regime would respond, but there could be a chance for a future dialogue, so we'll really have to wait and see, keep close tabs on that. But as for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here tonight. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Kim.
Thank you so much.
And of course, Professor Gaudin, we really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.